Greetings comrades, so today's video will be controversial as I theorise about the great villain of the novel, O'Brien, specifically his background and early years. Controversial as many will naturally question just how I can speak intelligently about a character we know so little about. However, while we do know very little about O'Brien's background, very little is not nothing. And I believe we can theorise intelligently about a likely path to inner party membership based on what we do know. If you're sceptical, I urge you to hear me out, and at any rate, I hope this is a fun thought exercise nonetheless. So what do we know about O'Brien's life before the events of the novel? Well, we have a rough age for the character at least, with Winston estimating that he is between 48 and 50. Winston also notes in a memorable few words how O'Brien looked far older close up, corroborating this age estimate. If we go with this gives us a birth year of between 1934 and 36. Some may question Winston's judgment on such things. However, if anything, he may be flattering O'Brien when we consider his physical condition. As we shall see, this age is important in determining what O'Brien might have been up to before the events of the novel. In any case, it's very safe to say he was either about this age or older, and not likely the same age or younger than Winston. Delving into the more speculative side of things, though we know nothing directly about O'Brien's earlier life, we can place it within the wider context of what we do know of party and in-universe history. We can also toy with probable origins, given what Goldstein's book tells us, and other subtle hints within the novel itself. So, assuming our age estimation is correct, even if we add a few more years, O'Brien would interestingly be within living memory of the events that led to the party's takeover. If born in the mid-1930s, he would have lived through the Second World War as a boy, perhaps playing among the ruins of the Blitz in London. Of course, unlike Winston himself, we cannot assume London has always been O'Brien's home. One definite thing we have is his name, which may indicate an Irish origin. This isn't that significant, however, given many folks with more distant Irish origins have, and do, live within the British Isles, sometimes for many generations. Winston also doesn't note any pronounced accent that might indicate such a solid connection to Ireland. What we can say then, with reasonable feasibility, is that O'Brien grew up with the war and witnessed Britain's young men leaving to fight the Germans, whilst he remained home among the ruins and destruction of war. By the end of the war, he would have been 8 to 10 years old, around Winston's age when he was taken underground during the later air raid that likely kicked off the Atomic War in 1954. Another feasible leap we can take, in my opinion, is that O'Brien's own memories probably stretch back to this time and beyond. I say this given his great intellect and clarity of thought. Though later possessing a disciplined and party-attuned mind, O'Brien likely can, and does when necessary, allow himself to recall such events as they relate to the party or his work, easily stopping short of any heretical thought through the use of Crime Stop and doublethink. So what kind of person might O'Brien have been? What were his origins? Interestingly, Goldstein's book actually gives us a rough idea of the types of people who came to make up the inner party after the party's rise. Quote, "The new aristocracy was made up for the most part of bureaucrats, scientists, technicians, trade union organisers, publicity experts, sociologists, teachers, journalists, and professional politicians. These people, whose origins lay in the salaried middle class and the upper grades of the working class, had been shaped and brought together by the barren world of monopoly industry and centralised government. Firstly, one thing we do know, or at least one thing we know is claimed by O'Brien himself, is that these words and the book were written by him and his colleagues, giving us a potential window into his own mind about events. The wording does allow for some movement of origins with the most part. However, given the balance of probabilities, and with no other thing indicating a particularly noble or high-class origin, Apart perhaps from Winston's early analogy of O'Brien as resembling an old-world nobleman, we can assume O'Brien originated from one of these broad groups, or at least likely did. O'Brien then was likely the son of fairly well-to-do parents. The aforementioned list is probably not exhaustive, so it's possible that O'Brien's father was something else. One thing we can do to perhaps focus our imaginations, as I hesitate to say this is a definitive answer, is to consider later descriptions of O'Brien in Part 3. In Part 3, Chapter 2, during Winston's interrogation, we do have some interesting analogies used that directly connect with the aforementioned professions. Quote, "When he spoke, his voice was gentle and patient. He had the air of a doctor, a teacher, even a priest, anxious to explain and persuade, rather than to punish." Of course, this is most likely coincidence, but it is interesting as an outside indication as to how Orwell perhaps viewed his character's origins. Note how the only one of the three in the previous quote, possibly written directly by O'Brien himself, is the teacher. This may be significant, as this connection appears to be reinforced with an additional analogy a little later in the same chapter. Quote, "O'Brien was looking down at him speculatively. More than ever, he had an air of a teacher taking pains with a wayward but promising child." Again, this is most likely a convenient analogy, a way of Orwell colouring the image for us, rather than any subtle nod to an origin. But though the intent may not have been there, could it have been a subconscious nod to a possible origin for the character? Later on, we see this type of behaviour repeated in the Room 101 scene. O'Brien said to be explaining things and looking away beyond Winston, as if to address an invisible audience. This perhaps has a more theatrical feel to it, but also reminds me of a teacher-like air, or perhaps a lecturer surveying his students to make sure they understand a subtle point. So what can we take from all of this in terms of origins? Well, admittedly nothing solid. We can reasonably say that O'Brien likely did come from the middle or upper working class, as that's what he essentially tells us in the book, that he assures Winston is true as description. Even if we assume O'Brien's origins are teacher-related, is there any real way to determine whether this behaviour is because he trained as a teacher during his youth, or that his parents were teachers? Maybe he has no connections at all to the profession, and he just comes across this way. So some interesting thoughts, but can we get a more solid feel for what O'Brien may have been doing in his younger adult life? Surprisingly, yes. We can theorise rather feasibly what O'Brien may have experienced and even been involved in during the party's very rise in the 1950s, as we do know a little about this time based on the lore we have. This is where previous videos in the Revolution or Civil War series come in handy, as it outlines the dates and how we get there, so check out those if you haven't done so already. It suffices to remind ourselves now that in 1954 the atomic war broke out, the key conflict in the lore that brings about the geopolitical reality we have in universe by the novel's plot. In 1954, O'Brien would have been between 18 and 20 years old, still below the age of majority for the time, but certainly a young man, and undoubtedly in the bracket for national service, assuming the practice continued in Orwell's world. Given the warlike nature of the universe, I find it impossible to believe that there wasn't national service. In our world, young men between 17 and 21 served 2 years, and in this world, it may have been as a frontline fighter, both in any conventional war against the USSR and then Eurasia, and later perhaps in the Civil War that we know happened, in which the military may have been split. Interestingly, if we indulge the earlier teacher origins theory, then perhaps O'Brien's father or both parents were exempt from any service, and if he was training to be such, then he could have been too. This aside though, if we leave O'Brien's profession open, then only a few paths would have left him untouched from military service. Farming and agricultural workers were exempt from any service, as well as workers in mines. Both occupations I think O'Brien likely had no part in. Medical staff were also exempt, so a possibility, though nothing other than a throwaway and isolated reference in an analogy connects to this. Any more formal professions anyway may have been a little out of his time, considering how young he was. He may have been training to become a teacher, doctor or whatever, but I highly doubt he was one of these at the time. I also factor into all of this the crisis of the time. One thing we memorably know about O'Brien is his impressive physicality. Winston describes O'Brien later in his life as possessing a prizefighter's physique. O'Brien was highly likely more than fit enough then to have done his military service in his youth. Yet why exactly is this all important? Well, one working theory I have is that O'Brien very likely fought in the Civil War, if not in the wider conflicts with the USSR or newly arisen Eurasia. Consulting the timeline constructed in previous talks, we know the Revolutionary War broke out sometime between late 1954 and early 1956, with the, quote, several months information indicating some or all of it likely took place in 1955. As O'Brien was a young man between 19 and 21, this means he was a fighting age man. Even if we add 10 years, he would still be well within this bracket. So this law reality opens up a couple of interesting possibilities. Firstly, that O'Brien was in the official military, or that he had been. Another more tantalising possibility too is that he was an early, fanatical member of the party's Black Shirts. We have explored the Black Shirts in a previous talk, but this is a law reality briefly detailed by Winston, who recalled the, quote, gangs of youths in shirts all the same colour. More support for this theory comes from one of O'Brien's more famous lines, "They got me a long time ago." This context gives the utterance a deeper meaning if we consider that, indeed, O'Brien was ideologically captured a long time ago, if I'm right. This is purely speculation on my part, but we do know that party speakers were likely very active in these pre-war years too, as the English socialist movement couldn't have just sprung up from nowhere to power in just a few months. I say this as the historical parties Orwell-based Ing Sok On certainly didn't, both the Bolsheviks and National Socialists developing over years before seizing power. The old man who speaks to Winston also recalls a Labour-critical speaker at Speaker's Corner, which may have been such an early party orator, perhaps a Goebbels or Lenin or even Austria painter-type figure. Could this, as was common in these historical movements, have been a young O'Brien's moment of capture? Imagine a young O'Brien returning from defeat in Europe as a conscript or volunteer. Eurasia now ruled the continent, and much like post-World War I Germany in our world, he is one of many angry and frustrated young men and women. Perhaps then he had his epiphany at a rally or meeting. A new hope sprung within him. Perhaps even the man whose words he intently listened to was even back then known by some of his inner circle as the big brother or guide of the movement, in a similar way that the historical Austrian painter was known as the leader in German, even by his inner circle in the earlier years of his own movement. This is educated speculation on my part, but I think you'll agree, quite possible and not entirely baseless given our knowledge of the law. Another figure of inspiration, of course, could have been, ironically enough, given O'Brien's later devotion to BB, Goldstein himself, or one of the original leaders we discussed in my previous talk, such as Jones or Aronson, for example. However O'Brien joined the party, I think he is being quite sincere and literal in his words to Winston in Part 3. He is the in-universe party equivalent of an old Bolshevik or old party fighter, if you prefer the National Socialist analogy. Not a senior member by any means at this point, as he would have been a young man during the party's rise. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that O'Brien did have some kind of junior leadership post, perhaps as an officer within the Black Shirts, the military, or both. Given his great intellect and what we later know about him too, it's evident he rose rapidly within the ranks of the party. How can I say this? Well, another piece of information we have is that he personally took part in the interrogation of Jones, Aronson and Rutherford. These men were arrested in around 1965 and executed around 1968. O'Brien then was working on the trio a decade after the Revolutionary War, which would have made him a man in or around his early 30s or very late 20s, very young for any kind of political leader. Of course, we don't know in what way O'Brien worked on these men, but it is impressive if we consider their importance as former revolutionary leaders. Would just any party official be trusted with such important thought criminals? I doubt it. Consider too that O'Brien was tasked, among others, with writing the book, no small intellectual feat if true, and purposed to fool paranoid and cautious closet thought criminals. Again, is this something given to just anybody, even within the inner party? Putting all of the pieces together then, I think it's very reasonable to assume O'Brien is not even your average inner party man, but a senior one. As I said before, an old Bolshevik type, and therefore a man of some prestige and gravitas in his own right. Given his presence in the novel, we know he not only fought with the revolutionaries, but was also on the winning side within the internal party struggle, fully on board it seems with the power-hungry faction's ambition of creating an eternal, unassailable class of power absolutists. So that was my theory on O'Brien's earlier life before the events of the novel, and his role within Oceania's anti-capitalist revolution. But what are your thoughts? Was O'Brien a street-fighting black-shirt leader? Was he captured ideologically at a rally or meeting? Or perhaps initially his eye was caught by a poster or leaflet produced by Rutherford, perhaps? Tell us all your thoughts as always in the comments section below. And remember, death to Eurasia, and long live Big Brother.